Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a world of silks, jewels, and candlelit chambers, but I'll warn you the smell might not be quite as glamorous as the gowns. Imagine a queen, her hair piled high and sparkling with pearls, but beneath all that fiery she hasn't bathed in weeks. Instead, her body is cloaked in layers of heavy rose and jasmine oils, the perfume so thick it lingers long after she leaves the room. You probably wouldn't survive this, at least not without sneezing yourself straight out of the banquet hall. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me in the comments where you're listening from tonight, and what time it is where you are. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The life of a royal woman in medieval Europe glittered in outward show, but daily reality was not always as sweet-smelling. Bathing, in the way you know it now, was rare and sometimes even frowned upon. Instead of slipping into a tub of warm water with soap, a queen was more likely to stand while her ladies-in-waiting rubbed her skin with lion cloths, dusted her with powders, and dusted her with perfume strong enough to make your eyes water. The scents themselves were not subtle: rose oil, violet, musk, ambergris, or even spikenard imported from far-off lands. These oils clung to their gowns and seeped into the tapestries around them. It was meant to mask the body's natural odor, which after days in heavy gowns, tight corsets, and crowded halls could not have been delicate. Perfume became almost a second skin. Imagine walking into a chamber where a queen had prepared for an audience. The air would be thick, almost syrupy with perfume, like stepping into a garden that had been left to wilt in summer heat. The fragrance wasn't just for delight, it was armor, a shield against accusations of poor cleanliness. A lady might dab perfume-soaked cloths at her wrists, press a scented pomander to her lips, or even keep perfumed gloves at hand to waft before her nose. You, as a guest, might have struggled to breathe politely while your eyes watered at the string. There is a strange irony here. The very act of masking unwashed skin with perfume was considered a sign of refinement. To smell like roses or amber was to announce you were wealthy enough to buy imported oils, wealthy enough not to work with your hands, wealthy enough to sweat under velvet and brocade without anyone daring to say a word. Historians still argue whether these perfumes truly fooled anyone, or whether courtiers simply learned to nod approvingly while holding their breath. One mainstream fact is that Queen Elizabeth I was said to bathe only once a month whether she needed it or not. Imagine what that meant in summer, with layers of silk, and the ever-present smoke from tallow candles clinging to skin and hair. Instead of daily washing, she relied on perfumes, powders, and the constant refreshment of scented gloves. But there were also more fringe details. Some queens carried pomanders, little metal balls filled with herbs and resin shining from their belts. The stronger the smell, the more fashionable. One queen of France supposedly preferred ambergris, a waxy substance from the bellets of whales, so intensely musky that modern noses would find it unbearable. Yet at the time, it was worth more than gold. You might chuckle to think of royal women walking about like living potpourri sachets, clouds of scent marking their passage through the palace halls. And perhaps you can picture the courtiers trying not to sneeze during long audiences. Perfume was not just fragrance but performance, a royal statement as visible as a crown. Still, beneath the perfume, the truth lingered. The gowns were seldom washed, the body beneath only lightly wiped with cloths. The perfumes did not clean, so they only covered. And when the candles burned low, and the court dispersed, the queen herself would carry that mix of sweat and roses into her bed. And so, as you drift in this candlelit haze, you can imagine yourself seated near her, nodding politely while the room grows heavier with scent, your eyes burning slightly, and a soft thought rising in your mind. Perfume might have been a royal veil, but it was never quite enough. The perfume may have disguised the body, but it could not hide everything. Behind the closed doors of royal chambers lurked another reality, one that was far less fragrant. Imagine a grand hall with soaring ceilings, tapestries embroidered with hunting scenes, a fire flickering low in the hearth. Off to the side, behind a carved wooden screen or perhaps in a corner curtained with velvet, sat a humble object, the chamber pot. For queens, even their privy was meant to be grander than a peasant's, but no matter how gilded the bowl, the truth remained: it was a pot, and it filled quickly. You picture the queen seated on a cushioned chair with a hole cut into it, known as a close stool. Beneath the seat was a removable pot, usually ceramic or metal, carried off by servants. But here's the trouble: those servants did not always hurry, and the smell did not politely disappear. Royal apartments, so fine in decoration, were haunted by these pots. Sometimes there were dozens scattered through a palace to serve the needs of ladies, courtiers, and visiting dignitaries. Emptying them was the work of the lowliest attendants, who carried the contents to cesspits or simply tipped them into the moat. You may smile at the thought of a glittering castle surrounded not by sparkling water but by a ring of foulness. One mainstream fact is that Versailles in France, though later than the medieval period, was infamous for its stench. Historians still argue whether accounts of courtiers relieving themselves in stairwells are exaggerated or not, but they agree that even the grandest palaces had sanitation woes. Medieval castles were little better. Some had garderobes, small closet-like rooms with a shaft dropping waste into the open air, often into the castle moat. But for queens, with their gowns too elaborate to manage long walks, the chamber pot was a constant companion. There's a quirky little detail. Sometimes ladies in waiting were tasked not only with emptying but with holding screens or perfumed cloths while their queen used the stool. Imagine that as part of your job description, standing politely, head bowed, while the queen conducted her business, then carrying away the evidence with as much dignity as one could muster. You might laugh softly at the image, a queen in velvet and pearls, rising from her throne to sit instead on a hidden stool, her crown catching the candlelight as she sighs, and nearby a wary servant thinking about the long walk to the cesspit. Royalty was grand, yes, but in these moments, humanity was unavoidable. The smells of court life mingled in curious ways. Perfume to cover sweat, incense to cover chamber pots, rushes on the floor sprinkled with herbs like lavender or mint. But the herbs decayed, and the chamber pots filled, and the queen herself was not immune to the unpleasantness. Sometimes even her silken chambers would be so heavy with odor that windows had to be flung wide, letting in a draught. And in winter, when closing the windows kept out the cold, you can imagine how thick the air became. There is something both humbling and oddly comforting in it. Queens and commoners alike faced the same reality of human needs. The difference was only in the velvet covering the stool or the embroidery on the curtain. You, if you stepped into such a chamber, might find yourself tightening your sleeve across your nose, trying to hide a cough, while the queen pretended nothing was amiss. Historians still argue whether queens themselves grew used to the smell or whether they truly found it as dreadful as visitors recorded. Perhaps, after years of life within stone walls and close quarters, the human nose simply adjusted. Yet visitors from abroad often remarked upon the foulness of European courts, especially when compared to the more frequent bathing and washing practices in places like the Islamic world. So as you picture the royal bedchamber, do not imagine a space of perfect lavender and rose. Instead, think of perfume mixed with something earthier, incense glowing faintly while a servant hurries past with a covered pot, and a queen arranging her skirts as though nothing at all had happened. That was the true fragrance of medieval royalty, a blend of roses and reality. Perfume and chamber pots might have shaped the atmosphere, but a queen's face, her most visible asset, was a battlefield of its own. To maintain the pale, smooth complexion that symbolized nobility, many royal women resorted to concoctions that sound more like alchemy than beauty care. Picture a queen seated before a polished metal mirror, candlelight flickering on her features. In front of her lie small jars and flasks, powders ground fine as flour, waters steeped in herbs, and, most troubling of all, mixtures of lead and vinegar. This beauty trick was no secret. White, flawless skin was the hallmark of wealth, proof that a woman did not labor outdoors under the sun. And so, to banish freckles, blotches, or the natural flush of blood, noble women painted their faces with a substance called ceruse. It was made by steeping lead shavings in vinegar, then grinding the residue into a creamy white paste. You dab it onto the skin, and instantly, you appear pale and smooth. But of course, lead was poison, and the paste did not simply rest on the surface. It seeped inward, damaging the very skin it was meant to perfect. One mainstream fact is that this practice persisted even into the Renaissance. Queen Elizabeth I herself is famously remembered for her mask of youth, a heavy coating of white lead makeup, applied throughout her reign, especially after smallpox left scars on her face. Historians still argue whether the thick layers contributed to her declining health, but the evidence suggests that many noble women slowly poisoned themselves in the name of beauty. Quirky details abound. Some recipes recommended mixing the lead paste with egg whites to give the skin a glossy sheen, almost like porcelain. Others advised washing the face with vinegar of roses or even urine, believing it would bleach away spots. Imagine the queen's attendants dutifully preparing these concoctions, all while the lady herself pinched her cheeks for a hint of color, then lined her eyes with soot or powdered antimony to make them look larger. You can almost smell the sharp tang of vinegar in the chamber, mixing with the musk of perfume oils. The queen leans forward, smoothing the mixture onto her cheeks, careful to avoid cracking the surface. Too much movement, and the paint would flake, leaving streaks on her gown's collar or a pale imprint on a lover's sleeve. You smile to think of a courtier leaving her presence marked not by lipstick but by a ghostly smear of white lead on his shoulder. Yet this was considered glamorous. The more perfect the mask, the more a queen's beauty seemed otherworldly, untouchable. Behind the powder, the skin might grow inflamed or pocked, but no one dared mention it aloud. Instead, they praised her luminous glow, even as her health won. Historians still argue whether queens knew the danger. Some say they must have, for the effects were obvious: hair thinning, teeth blackening, skin breaking beneath the surface. Others suggest they believe the harm came from age or illness, not from the very paint they applied each morning. And perhaps, in a way, the illusion of youth was worth the risk after all. In a court where beauty could secure alliances or ensure influence, to look pale and flawless was not vanity but survival. And then there were the odd touches. Cheeks dabbed with crushed cochineal for redness, lips reddened with cinnabar, a mercury-based pigment as toxic as the lead beneath it. Even the act of cleaning one's face was treacherous. for the removal often involved vinegar washes that stripped the skin raw. You might chuckle gently, imagining a queen sighing at the cracks forming in her painted mask, then ordering more powder, more rouge, more vinegar, convinced that tomorrow it might finally be perfect. And so, beneath the crown, behind the veil of silk, there lay a face painted into an ideal but quietly eroded by poison. It is a reminder that beauty, especially in royal courts, was not always natural, nor safe. It was a performance, fragile as eggshell, dangerous as lead, and clung to with the determination of someone who could not afford to look ordinary. If the royal face was painted into perfection, the hair was another story entirely. Imagine the endless layers of veils, hoods, circlets, and jeweled pins that crowned it. Queen's head. Beneath it all, her natural hair often went days, sometimes weeks, without a proper wash. The result? Strands that clung together with oil, nests of lice thriving in the warmth, and scalp itching so badly that attendants were forever combing and picking. Washing hair with water was rare. Instead, ladies used powders, ground herbs, crushed flowers, even finely milled wheat or rice flour. A lady-in-waiting might sprinkle the powder over her mistress' scalp, rub it gently with a linen cloth, and then come through, shaking out some of the oil along with a good share of dust. The result left the hair looking lighter, even perfumed, but it did not cleanse the way you would hope. Imagine the queen leaning forward, her hair dusting her lap with powder like flour shaken from a baker's hand. One mainstream fact is that lice combs have been found in archaeological digs from across medieval Europe, often carved from bone or wood with fine teeth. They were daily tools, carried even by the wealthy. Historians still argue whether queens truly endured the same level of infestation as peasants, but the evidence suggests that no head was entirely free of visitors. The powdered wigs and heavy veils did little to help. There's a quirky tidbit: some noblewomen kept pet birds, like canaries, in their chambers not just for companionship but because they believed the birds would pick lice from their hair. You can smile softly at the thought of a jeweled queen tilting her head, waiting for a bird to tie her scalp while her ladies look on, pretending this was perfectly normal. Hair, once powdered and perfumed, was twisted into elaborate braids, padded with false locks, and covered with headwear. For queens, this meant those tall cone-shaped headdresses or intricate veils stitched with pearls. The heavy coverings trapped heat, sweat, and oils against the scalp, making matters worse. By the time the hair was finally let down at night, it must have released a musk all its own. And yet, in court, appearances mattered more than freshness. A woman's hair, even unwashed, could be a symbol of majesty once adorned. Attendants brushed it smooth, powdered it again, and hid the truth beneath silks. You, if you were to sit behind the queen at a feast, might notice her turning her head and catch a faint whiff of the herbs sprinkled there, mixed with something earthier, less pleasant. But you would bow politely, say nothing, and later recall only the gleam of her jeweled veil in the candlelight. Historians still argue whether queens embraced wigs as a matter of fashion or necessity. Certainly, wigs provided escape from thinning hair caused by cosmetics and lice. But wigs themselves, stuffed with horsehair or wool padding, were no cleaner. They were seldom washed, often perfumed, and sometimes crawling with the same problem they were meant to solve. Imagine setting aside a wig at night, only to see it twitch faintly as its tiny inhabitants stirred. And so hair, like skin, became a canvas for disguise. Powder, perfume, wigs, veils all meant to convince the world that a queen was untouched by sweat or dust. Yet the truth was always there, beneath the silks: hair that longed for water, a scalp that longed for relief, and a woman who bore the itch with the same composure she wore her crown. You might chuckle gently, thinking how different it feels from your own nightly routine running a comb through clean hair, perhaps washing it under warm water, letting it fall loose before bed. For a queen, those simple comforts were luxuries rarely known. And perhaps, as you imagine her sighing in relief when the headdress finally slid off her head, you feel a quiet kinship. Even queens, after all, longed for the small comfort of a clean scalp. Now imagine the queen retreating at last to her bedchamber, wary from ceremonies, audiences, and endless layers of gown and perfume. You might expect her to sink into a bed of fresh linen, soft as cloud, but that truth was far less inviting. Royal beds, grand though they appeared, were rarely washed in the way you know today. The sheets might be changed only a few times a year, if that, and the heavy furs and embroidered coverlets could go seasons without being cleaned at all. Picture the bed itself, a towering frame carved from oak, draped with velvet curtains to keep out drafts. The others stuffed into mattresses, though luxurious, soon compacted, gathering dust, fleas, and even the occasional mouse that found its way into the warmth. The queen climbed beneath furs lined with silk, but those furs held the memory of every winter past, every night of sweat, every perfume that lingered in her hair and gowns. It was, in many ways, a history book written in scent. One mainstream fact is that medieval households, even royal ones, relied heavily on straw or rushes as bedding. Though queens lay on featherwoods, these still rested upon layers of organic material that attracted vermin. Historians still argue whether noble women tolerated the fleas as unavoidable, or whether attendants attempted to fumigate the bedding with herbs. Some records suggest beds were sprinkled with lavender or rosemary, their fragrance meant to mask not only odor but also the biting reality. There's a quirky tidbit. Certain noble households kept small dogs specifically as flea catchers. These little animals slept at the foot of the bed, supposedly drawing insects away from their human mistresses. Imagine the queen, shifting in her sleep while a small lapdog scratches away at the mattress beside her. Comforting, perhaps, but also noisy. The irony is striking. Royal beds were symbols of majesty, often paraded as part of a bride's dowry or described in chronicles for their beauty. Yet the reality of lying in them was quite different. The sheets absorbed oils from unwashed skin, the coverlets soaked perfume until they grew sour, and the air between the curtains grew heavy. You, if you stepped into such a chamber, might hesitate before sitting, fearing what lurked in the folds of velvet. Candles, burned close to the bed, left soot upon the drapery, adding another layer of grime. Attendants sometimes beat the mattresses in the morning, sending up clouds of dust into the air, only to have it settle again by nightfall. Imagine sneezing as you pass through the haze, while the queen smiles warily, as though accustomed to it. Historians still argue whether queens themselves insisted on more frequent laundering or whether even they bowed to the practical difficulties. Washing heavy fabrics was a monumental task. Water had to be carried, firewood consumed to heat it, soap costly and harsh. Instead, airing the sheets in sunlight or dusting them with herbs was considered sufficient. Yet sunlight was not always plentiful, and winters were long. And so, the queen's bed, so glorious in outward appearance, was a paradox, beautiful yet unclean, grand yet uncomfortable. You might chuckle softly, imagining her sighing as she pulled the curtain closed, muttering to herself that even a peasant's cottage bed of fresh straw might have felt lighter. Of course she could not say such a thing aloud. To be a queen was to sleep in luxury, fleas and all. You can almost hear the faint rustle of furs, the creak of oak beams, and the soft scratching of a dog settling at her feet. In that dim warmth, the perfumes of the day mingled with the scents of years gone by, and the royal woman closed her eyes, surrendering to a sleep that was never as clean, nor as restful, as the gilded image suggested. When morning came, the queen rose from her perfumed bed, but her teeth told a different story. Dental care in medieval Europe was a patchwork of strange remedies, curious powders, and plenty of superstition. Imagine her seated before her mirror once again, this time with a servant holding a small bowl of crushed herbs and cloth. Toothbrushes as you know them did not yet exist, and toothpaste was more imagination than science. A queen might rub her teeth with a rag dipped in wine, vinegar, or even salt water. Sometimes she used powders made from ground sage leaves, burnt rosemary, or powdered pumice stone. The goal was to scrape away buildup and leave a fresher smell, but without soap or fluoride. The results were mixed. You, watching her, might notice the gentle scraping sound of cloth against enamel. A rhythm meant more to freshen the breath than to save the tooth. One mainstream fact is that sugar consumption among the wealthy made dental problems far worse than among peasants. While peasants ate coarse bread and porridge, queens enjoyed candied fruits, spiced wine, and honeyed pastries. Historians still argue whether tooth decay was seen as a normal part of noble life or as an unfortunate side effect of indulgence. Some chronicles hint that blackened teeth were simply accepted, though they may also have been discreetly concealed with powders. There's a quirky little tidbit. One medieval recipe for tooth powder recommended mixing crushed eggshells with burnt deer antler and a touch of honey. Imagine dabbing that onto your cloth, smiling bravely as you rubbed it against your molars, hoping for a shine. Another remedy suggested rinsing with wine infused with cloves, not so bad until you remembered it was considered a disinfectant as well as a flavor. Attendants often carried scented herbs like mint or parsley, which queens chewed to mask bad breath before banquets. Picture her leaning toward a visiting ambassador, smiling through lips painted red with cinnabar, while parsley leaves tucked at the back of her teeth gave off a faintly green perfume. It was not the freshness you're used to, but it was good enough for diplomacy. The truth was, dental pain haunted many noble households. Without proper cleaning, cavities grew deep, gums bled, and teeth loosened. Extraction was the common solution performed by barbers rather than physicians. Imagine the queen, her dignity unshaken, sitting as a barber tugged at a molar while courtiers whispered behind their hands. There were no numbing gels, only a cloth to grip and perhaps a sip of strong wine beforehand. Historians still argue whether queens actually underwent such crude extractions themselves, or whether they simply endured the pain, keeping to soft foods and scented herbs. After all, admitting to decay was admitting to weakness, and royal image was everything. Yet letters and household accounts hint at purchases of herbal mouthwashes, tooth powders, and even toothpick boxes made of silver, suggesting that oral care, in its strange medieval form, was still an important part of courtly life. You might chuckle gently, thinking of the irony, queens dining on gilded platters, drinking from jewel-encrusted goblets, yet afterward scrubbing their teeth with burnt rosemary or rinsing with vinegar. No peppermint freshness, no porcelain smile, only a hopeful blend of sage and wine. And so, each morning, alongside the paints for her face, and the powders for her hair, the queen tended her teeth as best she could. She leaned close to her mirror, rubbed, rinsed, and prayed that the smile she offered the court would shine brightly enough to distract from whatever pain lurked behind it. Perfume and powders could only go so far, for the queen's chambers were never her own alone. They teemed with life, both human and animal. Pets, particularly small dogs and cats, were beloved companions in the courts of Europe, and they left their own fragrant imprint. Imagine stepping into a royal chamber where the scent of roses clung to the air, but underneath lingered something distinctly muskier, the damp fur of a lapdog, the scratch of claws on wooden floors, the faint odor of cats that curled themselves upon silken cushions. One mainstream fact is that noble women kept animals not only for affection but also as symbols of status. Paintings from the period show queens holding tiny spaniels or white cats as emblems of purity and refinement. Yet behind the symbolism was the reality: animals ate, scratched, and soiled. Historians still argue whether attendants diligently cleaned after them or whether the chamber simply absorbed their presence along with everything else. The truth is likely a mix. Some days spotless, others not so much. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some noblewomen even kept bird sparrows brought from distant lands or nightingales prized for their songs. The birds were often perfumed themselves, their feathers brushed with scented oils so they would not stink of their cages. Imagine a queen gently stroking her parrot's feathers, releasing a strange mixture of exotic musk and rose oil into the already heavy air of the chamber. The pets were loved, of course. A lapdog might curl beneath the queen's bed covers, its warmth a comfort in drafty castles. But along with warmth came fleas, and with fleas came the constant scratching of both animal and mistress. You might chuckle softly, imagining a queen at a banquet reaching beneath her velvet gown to surreptitiously scratch her leg, while her dog does the same at her feet. The mixture of scents was peculiar: perfumed gloves laid aside on a table, incense burning to drive away foulness, a dog padding across rushes scattered with lavender, and a cat leaping up to knead the coverlet with muddy paws. In a world without vacuum cleaners or constant laundering, the chamber bore it all. Guests might smile politely, remarking on the queen's charming pets, even as they tugged their sleeves closer to their noses. Historians still argue whether animals were permitted to roam freely through royal apartments or whether they were more restricted. Some accounts describe dogs yapping through great halls, others suggest they were carefully kept in chambers. What is certain is that queens adored them, tolerating the smells and the mess as a small price for companionship in a life otherwise governed by duty and ceremony. You can imagine the scene late at night, the queen drawing her bed curtains, the room lit only by a dying candle, her dog curling at her feet, her cat purring at her side. Outside, the wind rattles the shutters. Inside, the musk of animal fur mingles with the faded perfume on her skin. She sighs, comforted yet surrounded by smells that no amount of ambergris could ever quite banish. And so, in the middle of all the grandeur, queens lived with pet smells as surely as anyone else. Perhaps that is the most human detail of all. Beneath a crown and pearls, she was simply a woman who wanted the warmth of a creature beside her in the dark. Whether or not her attendants wrinkled their noses when they drew near. Bathing itself might have solved many of these problems, but here lies the strangest twist: queens in medieval Europe often avoided public baths altogether. Imagine, if you will, the steaming bathhouses of towns and cities, places where water was heated in great cauldrons, poured into communal tubs, and filled with the chatter of men and women. Once, in earlier centuries, even nobles used these baths. But by the later Middle Ages, whispers of scandal clung to them. One mainstream fact is that by the 14th and 15th centuries, bathhouses across Europe had gained a reputation not just for bathing but for illicit meetings. Historians still argue whether all of them truly deserve this reputation or whether it was exaggerated by moralists and preachers. Either way, noble women hesitated to be seen entering one. To soak in public water was to risk your reputation as much as your health. And health was no small matter. There was a growing belief that warm water opened the pores of the skin and allowed disease to seep in. Doctors warned against frequent bathing, suggesting that it weakened the body. Imagine a queen frowning at the idea of slipping into a steaming tub, fearful that she might emerge not refreshed but feverish. And so, instead of bathing, she dabbed at her skin with lion cloths, rinsed her hands with rose water, and returned to perfumes to do the rest. Here's a quirky tidbit: some queens commissioned private wooden tubs lined with cloth, brought into their chambers on special occasions. Attendants filled them with warm water scented with herbsame, chamomile, or marjoram. But these baths were rare events, treated almost like medicine rather than routine. You might chuckle softly, imagining a queen reluctantly lowering herself into a tub, attendants standing nearby with towels, while she insists, only once this season no more. The irony is clear. Common folk, especially in warmer regions, often bathe more freely in rivers or simple tubs. But the queen, with her silks and jewels, was bound by fear of gossip and illness. Even when she longed for the relief of water against her skin, she restrained herself, choosing instead to layer powders and perfumes. Historians still argue whether avoidance of bathing was more about morality, fear of disease, or sheer impracticality in palaces not designed for running water. Likely it was a blend of all three. What we know is that queens were not often seen enjoying the cleansing streams that today you would consider essential. Imagine yourself walking through a medieval city on a summer evening. You pass a bathhouse, ladder echoing from within, steam curling out of open windows. But in the palace above, the queen sits by her fire, dabbing rosewater on her wrists, telling herself she is too noble, too cautious, to enter such a place. You might smile gently at her stubbornness, knowing that her perfume could never match the freshness of even one honest bath. And so the bathhouse once a symbol of community and refreshment became a place of suspicion, leaving noble women to cloak themselves in scents and silks instead of water. For the queen, cleanliness was not a matter of soap and steam but of status and restraint, a strange reversal that left her less fresh than the peasants she ruled. If the queen rarely touched a bath, then her gowns bore the burden of her body. Imagine layer upon layer, a lion shift closest to the skin, then underskirts, kirtles, gowns of velvet or brocade, and finally a cloak trimmed in fur. Each piece grew heavier with wear, each layer trapping heat and sweat. Yet these garments were not washed off and sometimes not at all. Instead, they were brushed, beaten, or sprinkled with herbs to mask the odor. One mainstream fact is that laundering fine fabrics was difficult and costly. Silk and velvet warped in water, dyes bled, and fur stiffened. Washing was reserved for simple lion shifts, and even those might only be laundered once every few weeks. Historians still argue whether noble households truly kept dozens of clean shifts for rotation or whether queens simply endured wearing the same garment longer than modern comfort would allow. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some shifts were stitched so stiff with sweat and body oils that they could practically stand on their own when removed. Servants wrote of garments so grimy that no amount of beating or sunning could sweeten them. Imagine a laundress holding up a queen's discarded chemise with two reluctant fingers, wrinkling her nose as she carried it off. The outer gowns, far more costly, were almost never washed. Instead, they were perfumed. A chest might be lined with herbs like lavender, juniper, or even dried rose petals. Gloves were scented, veils dusted with powders, and cloaks smoked gently over incense to disguise the musk of human life beneath. You, if you approached the queen at court, might marvel at her magnificency, the glitter of jewels, the rustle of silks, and only later notice the faint shadow of sweat stitched invisibly into every seam. Clothing itself contributed to the problem. Tight bodices pressed against the skin, trapping oils. Furs grew musty in damp weather. Heavy gowns made even short walks exhausting, so that perspiration was inevitable. Yet removing layers was rarely an option, for modesty demanded fullness of dress. And so the garments became both a prison and a disguise, holding odors close while presenting an image of splendor. Historians still argue whether queens themselves complained of the discomfort or whether etiquette silenced such voices. We know, however, that attendants often sprinkled clothing with vinegar or rosewater, patting the fabric with cloths to refresh it before public appearances. This was no true cleansing, but it gave at least a passing illusion. You might chuckle gently at the contradiction: gowns worth a small kingdom, embroidered with gold thread and trimmed with ermine, yet lined with sweat stains never seen by anyone but the unlucky laundress. Imagine the queen sighing in relief at night as her gown is unfastened, the air around her suddenly lighter, her skin damp and pale beneath the lion's shift. And yet, despite it all, the clothing did its work. To see a queen so richly dressed was to see power itself, no matter what lingered beneath. For the courtier bowing before her, the sparkle of gems and the shimmer of silk were what mattered, not the hidden odors stitched into the folds. And so the queen endured. She moved through her days cloaked in grandeur and sweat alike, her gowns magnificent but heavy, her underclothes seldom fresh. You, imagining yourself in such attire, might laugh softly and admit that 5 minutes would have been enough. She, however, lived her life within its silk and musk, perfume and perspiration, forever woven together. If the gowns carried their burdens, then cosmetics tried to lighten the queen's appearance, though often with cruel irony. Imagine her seated again before her mirror, attendants fluttering about with jars, brushes, and powders. By candlelight, her face gleams with a thin coat of white lead, her lips touched with vermilion, her lashes darkened with soot. She looks ethereal, almost otherworldly. But beneath the mask, her skin prickles, burns, and ages faster with each application. One mainstream fact is that medieval and Renaissance cosmetics were far from gentle. Women used kohl made of soot or antimony to line their eyes, believing it made them appear larger and more striking. Rouge came from crushed insects or mercury compounds. Masks made from egg whites tightened the skin temporarily, giving a glossy sheen. Yet none of these treatments offered nourishment and the illusion. Historians still argue whether queens truly fooled their courtiers or whether everyone politely ignored the cracks, flakes, and sometimes grotesque side effects of this painted elegance. Here's a quirky tidbit: some women mixed Dove droppings with rosewater to create a kind of facial paste believed to soften skin. Others recommended bread soaked in milk, left overnight to ferment slightly, then spread across the face. Imagine the queen sitting perfectly still, her cheeks covered in curdled bread paste while her ladies-in-waiting fan her with feathers, pretending this was a normal part of beauty. Candlelit halls helped the illusion. Soft light smoothed over imperfections, turning the queen's painted mask into a vision. But in daylight, especially outdoors, the effect was less forgiving. Heavy powders cracked, rouge streaked with sweat, and egg-white masks flaked in the sun. You might chuckle gently, imagining a royal procession where the queen smiled brightly while her attendants desperately dabbed at her face, trying to stop it from melting. The cost of beauty was not just discomfort. Prolonged use of lead-based cosmetics caused skin ulcers, hair loss, and trembling hands. Lips reddened with mercury compounds grew inflamed, even as courtiers praised their color. Yet these dangers did little to diminish the fashion. To appear flawless was worth the suffering. And in a court where alliances were shaped as much by appearances as by words, beauty was a tool as sharp as any sword. Historians still argue whether noble women understood that their cosmetics aged them faster. Some say they must have noticed, yet chose to persist because the alternative natural skin would have been seen as coarse or common. Others believe they truly trusted the recipes passed down through households, convinced that herbs and minerals gave vitality rather than poison. Perhaps, in truth, it was a mixture of hope, denial, and necessity. And so the queen's face became a canvas, painted each morning, repainted as needed through the day, and finally scrubbed at night with vinegar or wine. The skin beneath grew weary, lined, and damaged, but the mask never faltered in public. You, picturing her sighing as the paint was wiped away, might feel both pity and admiration. She was not merely vain, she was performing, upholding an image demanded of her. It is a strange thought, that the most powerful women of their age felt compelled to risk their health simply to look as fragile and luminous as porcelain dolls. Yet that was the stage of medieval court life, and every queen was both actress and audience, painted into perfection with soot, lead, and faith. Perfume was not reserved for the skin alone, a clothing itself became a canvas for scent. Imagine a queen receiving a pair of gloves, not ordinary ones but richly embroidered, lined with fine leather, and soaked in perfume until every movement of her hands released a cloud of fragrance. These perfumed gloves were treasured gifts, often exchanged between nobles, their scent lasting for weeks. A queen, waving her hand during a courtly dance, left behind not only the shimmer of jewels but a waft of musk or rose that clung to the air. One mainstream fact is that perfumed gloves became especially fashionable by the late Middle Ages and well into the Renaissance. They were considered both practical and luxurious, practical in that they masked the odors of unwashed hands, luxurious in that they required costly imported oils. Historians still argue whether queens favored them primarily as fashion or whether they truly depended on them to disguise daily hygiene struggles. Here's a quirky tidbit. Sometimes gowns themselves were drenched in scented waters or lined with sachets of herbs stitched into the seams. A dress might carry little pouches filled with lavender, cloves, or dried rose petals hidden beneath the fabric. Imagine the queen sweeping past, her velvet hem brushing the rushes on the floor, releasing a faint herbal trail wherever she walked. Yet the herbs themselves decayed over time, leaving odd smells mixed with the perfume, something between sweetness and rot. The effect, however, was convincing enough in the candlelit halls of a palace. Courtiers, leaning close to kiss the queen's hand, might catch a strong note of orange blossom or amber, never quite sure whether it was her skin or her glove. You might chuckle softly, imagining their surprise if they ever discovered the truth that beneath the glove, the queen's hand was roughened by vinegar washes or sticky with oils. Perfuming clothing was a ritual. Chests were filled with dried herbs to scent garments between wearings, gloves were dipped and left to dry for days, and veils were fanned over incense to absorb its fragrance. In a sense, queens carried their own little weather of scent with them, a halo that preceded their presence. Yet the illusion was fragile. Sweat eventually seeped through, oils grew rancid, and herbs lost their strength. Historians still argue whether attendants refreshed gowns frequently enough to keep the illusion constant, or whether courtiers simply learned to accept the fading perfume as part of royal life. After all, even when the gown smelled less than fresh, it was still a gown stitched with gold. You might smile gently at the image, a queen adjusting her perfumed gloves before a banquet, satisfied that her hands now smell of roses, while around her the chamber pot fumes drift faintly from a corner. The perfumes never quite conquered the reality, but they did their best. And so perfume became more than adornment, it was armor. It disguised not only the queen's body but her clothing itself, presenting an illusion of constant freshness in a world where laundering was rare. She moved through her court as though wrapped not just in silk and fur, but in an invisible cloak of scent, fragile though it was. Strangely enough, one of the biggest obstacles to royal cleanliness wasn't simply inconvenience, it was fear. By the later Middle Ages, a curious belief had taken root, that bathing too often could make you ill. Imagine the queen sitting by her fire, her ladies suggesting a warm bath with herbs, and her shaking her head firmly. No, she insists, to open the pores is to invite sickness. One mainstream fact is that medieval medical theory, rooted in humors, taught that pores opened during hot baths, leaving the body vulnerable to miasmas of bad airs thought to carry disease. Cleanliness, therefore, became a dangerous luxury. Historians still argue whether queens genuinely believed this or whether they used it as an excuse to avoid the hassle of bathing, but the effect was the same. Water was feared as much as dirt. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some queens substituted dry bathing, which meant wrapping themselves in fresh linens or rubbing the skin with cloth steeped in aromatic vinegar. It was thought that linen itself drew impurities out of the skin. You can picture the queen reclining on a chair while attendants pressed warm cloths to her arms and face, almost like a spa treatment, yet no water touched her body. Instead of bathing, physicians recommended perfumes, powders, and herbal fumigations. The queen might sit in a chamber where herbs were burned, letting the smoke cleanse her skin. Imagine her breathing through a perfumed cloth, nodding solemnly while the air grew thick with sage and juniper. To her, this was health itself. And yet, the irony is sharp. In times of plague, washing hands with clean water might have helped. Instead, nobles clung to their fear of moisture, convinced it weakened the body. Historians still argue whether this avoidance actually worsened outbreaks, though many point to it as a curious misstep of medieval medicine. The queen, meanwhile, endured the discomforts with quiet resolve. To her, restraint was protection. While peasants bathed in rivers and sweated honestly in their fields, she remained cloaked in silks, perfumes, and dry cloths, her skin rarely touched by flowing water. You might chuckle gently, imagining her attendants sighing as they folded away yet another unused bathtub, muttering under their breath that perhaps, just this once, a little water wouldn't hurt. But now the fear was stronger. Better to keep the body dry, the pores closed, the health intact, or so they believed. And so, queens lived in a paradox. Surrounded by wealth, they denied themselves the simplest of refreshings, convinced that water was an enemy. In that world, to remain dry was to remain safe, even if it meant carrying the constant weight of perfumes, powders, and all the odors they tried in vain to conceal. If fear of bathing shaped a queen's body, then dining habits shaped her reputation in other curious ways. Imagine a grand banquet hall, tapestries glowing in candlelight, tables laden with roasted peacocks, sugared almonds, and spiced wines. At the head sits the queen, draped in jewels, every eye fixed upon her as she lifts a gilded goblet. But notice something odd, no fork rests beside her plate. One mainstream fact is that forks were slow to be adopted in medieval Europe, not becoming common until much later. Instead, queens and nobles ate with their fingers, or with knives shared at the table. Bread served as a plate, absorbing sauces, and hands became sticky with grease. Historians still argue whether this was seen as crude or simply normal. For queens, it was softened by etiquette. Wiping fingers on tablecloths, napkins, or the hems of lion shifts. Here's a quirky tidbit. Scented basins were sometimes brought out mid-feast, filled with rose water. The queen dipped her fingers delicately, then dabbed them dry with a perfumed cloth. Imagine the relief of that cool rinse after tearing into sugared meats or oily fish. Yet, between these moments, she continued to handle food directly, as did everyone else. The image is both regal and human. A queen, her crown catching the light, leans forward to pick up a morsel of candied fruit. A drop of syrup glistens on her finger, and she licks it away before turning to address an ambassador. You might chuckle softly, imagining the ambassador pretending not to notice, his smile fixed as though nothing unusual had occurred. Cleanliness at table was an aspiration more than a reality. Brazy nails, sticky fingertips, and crumbs clinging to jeweled rings were simply part of dining. Perfumed gloves could not be worn at the feast, and perfumes themselves could not disguise the mingled smells of food, sweat, and hundreds of bodies pressed close in the hall. Historians still argue whether queens were held to stricter standards than their male counterparts. Chronicles sometimes praise noble women for eating daintily, but others reveal complaints of poor manners. After all, when hands were the main utensils, even the most careful eater left the table less than spotless. You might picture the scene at the feast's end, platters stripped bare, dogs sniffing under the trestle tables, and the queen leaning back with a faint smile, her hands shining with grease despite the rose water rinse. Attendants hurry forward with cloths, dabbing at her rings, scrubbing gently until the scent of cloves masks the lingering odor of roast meat. And so, even in the most refined settings, hygiene was never entirely absent from the struggle. The queen's beauty and dignity might dazzle, but the reality of sticky fingers and unwashed nails lingered behind the glow of the banquet candles. Even beyond the queen's chamber and banquet table, the very atmosphere of court life carried its own fragrancy mixture, both enchanting and unbearable. Imagine stepping into a great hall, banners fluttering, courtiers whispering beneath vaulted ceilings. Candles burn in iron chandeliers overhead, dripping wax onto rushes scattered across the floor. At first, the air is sweet with incense and roses. But linger a moment longer, and you catch the truth beneath, the sour tang of sweat, the acrid smoke of tallow, and the unmistakable stench of chamber pots tucked discreetly behind curtains. One mainstream fact is that medieval castles and palaces relied heavily on incense to mask unpleasant odors. Frankincense, myrrh, and other resins were burned not only for ceremony but for sanitation, or so it was believed. Historians still argue whether incense truly helped or whether it merely mingled with existing smells to create an even heavier atmosphere. What is certain is that the scent of sanctity often coexisted with something closer to rot. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some courts experimented with scattering sweet-smelling herbs on the floor, called strewing herbs. When walked upon, they released fragrance, mint, thyme, even marjoram. But as the evening wore on, these herbs were trampled, mixed with spilled wine, animal droppings from dogs roaming the hall, and grease dripped from feasting tables. Imagine the crunch of crushed mint beneath your shoes, its fragrance giving way to a more pungent stew of smells. The queen herself could not escape this. Even when she carried her perfumed gloves and embroidered sachets, the air of the court was always a mixture of sweetness and sourness, roses and rot. You might chuckle softly, imagining her leaning to whisper to a lady in waiting, "Is it me, or is the lavender losing the battle tonight?" Only to cover the moment with a serene smile. The paradox of royal life was laid bare in these halls. They were dazzling to the eyes, gilded, jeweled, embroidered, but never quite fresh to the nose. Visitors from other lands often remarked on the odors, sometimes with polite restraint, sometimes with outright dismay. Yet within Europe's courts, such scents were simply accepted as part of daily life. Historians still argue whether courtiers genuinely grew accustomed or whether they simply had no choice but to tolerate it. After all, proximity to power required patience not only for politics but for smells. To stand near the queen was an honor worth enduring a little foulness. And so, the court reeked in its peculiar way. Roses battling chamber pots, incense fighting smoke, strewing herbs trampled into the rushes. For every fragrant candle, there was a sour draught from a garderobe. For every sweet sachet, a reminder of dogs and men pressed close. You might imagine yourself there, seated near the queen, your nose filled with that strange clash of odors. It is almost comic, the greatest halls in Europe, smelling not of purity but of contradiction. Yet beneath it all, the queen held her dignity, moving through the haze as though she noticed nothing, her perfume a fragile crown of its own. At last, the story of royal hygiene in medieval Europe edges toward its turning point. Imagine the queen, grown older, gazing into her mirror. The perfumes, powders, and painted masks have carried her through decades, but whispers of new customs drift into court. Traders return from distant lands with cakes of soap, solid, scented, and strange. At first, it is treated more as a luxury trinket than a necessity, but slowly, ever so slowly, the idea of true bathing begins to creep back into noble life. One mainstream fact is that soap making, especially in places like Castile and Marseille, was already flourishing by the late Middle Ages. Olive oil soaps, sometimes perfumed with herbs, were exported across Europe. Historians still argue whether queens themselves adopted them readily or whether these soaps were used mainly for linens and hands. Yet the records show that noble households began ordering them in small but telling quantities. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some ladies believed that too much soap would strip away the noble paleness of their skin, so they used it sparingly, almost like a cosmetic in itself. Imagine the queen carefully dabbing a bar of Castile soap onto her cheek as though it were rouge, then laughing softly when her attendants assured her it was meant for water, not powder. Gradually, bathing shifted from suspicion to fashion. Private tubs became more common, filled not only with warm water but with soap bubbles, herbal sachets, and rose petals floating upon the surface. The queen, once fearful that bathing would sicken her, now allowed herself the rare indulgence, if only to keep pace with the currents of fashion. You might smile gently, picturing her sighing in surprise at how refreshing it felt, as though she had rediscovered something long forgotten. Historians still argue whether this return to soap was truly widespread among noblewomen before the Renaissance blossomed, or whether it remained a rare luxury for queens alone. Either way, the seeds of change were planted. Slowly, the association of water with disease weakened, and the simple act of washing began to be seen as a mark of refinement rather than risk. And so, after centuries of perfume, powders, and disguises, the quiet shift began. The queen, still draped in silks and crowned with pearls, now held in her chamber a bar of soap, small, humble, but a sign that times were changing. Her daughters and granddaughters would inherit not only her jewels but her new habits, stepping a little closer to the cleanliness you know today. You might chuckle softly at the thought, all those years of chamber pots and perfume clouds, of vinegar face washes and rosemary powders, only to find in the end that the simplest answer was the one always feared: soap and water. Now that the candles of history have burned low, let us soften the rhythm and set the past gently aside. You've walked the dim corridors of medieval palaces, breathed in their curious blend of roses and smoke, and peered at queens whose perfume and powders masked more than they revealed. For all their silks, their jewels, their titles, they lived lives where comfort and cleanliness were often out of reach. And perhaps, as you rest here tonight, you feel a quiet gratitude for the warm bath, the clean sheets, and the little comforts of your own life. Close your eyes, and picture a softer scene. Not the heavy stone walls of a drafty hall, but a chamber lit only by the golden glow of embers. A gentle snowfall drifts beyond the shutters. Inside, the queen lays aside her perfumed gloves and jeweled veil. The little lapdog curls at her feet, purring faintly in its sleep, the room hushed but for the crackle of the fire. The perfumes have faded, the incense has cooled, and at last, the Air is still. You feel yourself breathing easier, slower, as though you too have stepped behind velvet curtains and settled into a bit of calm. The sounds of the world beyond the chamber drift away. No perfumes, no powders, no weight of ceremony, only the soft touch of linen, the faint hum of the night, and the warmth of a fire that will not fail. Let the images fade now into quiet comfort, the glow of hearth light, the hush of snow outside, the whisper of a candle burning low. Allow yourself to drift, gently, peacefully, toward sleep. You are safe here, wrapped not in silks and furs but in stillness itself. Good night, dear listener. Sweet dreams.